This is a story called The Cholera Epidemic. It's the early 1900s and there are families living in rundown slums. There are couples who have 10 or more kids in a two-room property, or in some cases one-room properties. The buildings contain about 30 flats in each row, and there's not just kids and their parents living there. In some cases, the families have cousins, grandparents and aunts and uncles all living in one property. Each block only has one toilet and the families have to share it and use buckets. They also have to share the same bath water and the drinking water wasn't very clean. One day one of the kids started to feel unwell. Within hours she became seriously ill and the doctor was called, but despite his best efforts to save her, she died aged just 5 years old. Then other people started getting sick and the doctor knew that he had a growing epidemic on his hands. But he needed to find out what the illness was so he could give people the right treatment. He strongly suspected that it was cholera, but he wasn't sure. He decided to look up the symptoms in one of his medical books and was able to confirm that it was a cholera epidemic. Within 24 hours, 4 people had died from the illness, including the 5-year-old girl, and many more were sick. The doctor was completely out of his depth and he was doing everything he could to help people, but people were still getting sick and dying, and a lot of them were kids. Those that weren't sick were trying to help the doctor, but of course they became exposed to it and eventually became sick themselves. Despite being put into quarantine, people were still getting sick and dying simply because there was no clean water and people were sharing toilets, etc. The buildings were filthy and very run down. Every flat in each building was severely overcrowded, with huge families living in every one. People were forced to share beds and to sleep on the floor. The living conditions were absolutely dreadful and the doctor was used to people constantly being sick, but he'd never experienced an epidemic before. Despite the doctor's best efforts, people continued to get sick and die. Within 3 days, 20 people had died, including 5 children. The doctor was exhausted, but he carried on treating and trying to save the sick on little sleep and not much time to stop and eat. However, someone had managed to find another doctor and they sent him to help. Despite this, people continued to get sick and die. Thankfully, after almost 2 weeks, the epidemic seemed to be calming down. However, just as everyone thought this, more people became sick and died. The doctors thought it was never going to be over because more and more people were still getting sick and dying. After trying to battle the epidemic for over a month, the doctors thought it was never going to end. They battled on for a further 3 weeks, and by this time there was 4 doctors who were all exhausted. After well over 2 months, things finally started to calm down and less people were getting sick. Those who were sick survived and eventually life went back to normal. The death toll reached 200, including 60 children, all aged between 2 and 16 years old. The doctors knew that something like this would happen again because of the way the poor were forced to live. There was nothing they could do to stop it. However, they were relieved that they'd saved as many lives as they possibly could. Once everyone was well enough, they held a memorial service for all those who had died, and plaques were put up with all their names on. People complained to the landlord who owned the buildings about the poor living conditions. He didn't do anything to make things better and he just didn't seem to care. As a result of the landlord's carelessness, people constantly continued getting sick and dying. Then one day people heard that the landlord had sold all the buildings. When the new landlord came to look around the flats, he was appalled by the living conditions. There were quite a few empty properties, and the landlord decided to knock through to add more room to the other flats. He also had indoor plumbing installed in each flat, and there was always clean water. The flats were still overcrowded, but the living conditions were a lot better than they were before, and people weren't getting sick as much. The new landlord always listened to his tenants, and he always took time out to visit them and to help them any way he could. Unlike the old landlord, he cared about the tenants, and he was always happy to help them as much and as often as he possibly could. The end. Thank you.